welcome to this year's Peter Ray and Ellen Jones New Testament lecture. We have these not necessarily every year, but most every year, bringing in informative scholars from literally around the world that help us explore more deeply and thickly the New Testament text and its challenges to us in the world in which we live. We're glad that you are here. Nikki, I'm going to turn it over to you for just a moment to give a couple of housekeeping matters, and then we'll introduce our presenters today.
Absolutely, everybody. I'm so glad that you've joined us today. Just a couple of housekeeping things to think about. As Dean Deloach already mentioned, please mute your microphone. It just helps with feedback and if you've got anything going on in the background so it does not interrupt. I also want to encourage you if you need to take a break at any point, just feel free to get up and go, take your break. If you are one of those who will take us with you on your break, make sure your video is off and your mic is muted. And it's just a friendly reminder. But we are not going to take a formal break. We're just going to go all the way through. So take your breaks as needed, and then come back as soon as you can. Two more things. One is please feel free to use the chat to engage with the material. That is something that naturally happened at our Mercer Preaching consultation in the fall, and it provided a very rich conversation. I will save those chats and send them out to all participants at the end. And the plan is also to send you a recording of what we do today too, so that you can go back and review the material if you want to. And I think that's all that I have for today. So Dean Deloach, I'll pass it back over to you.
Absolutely. Once again, we're glad you're here. We've got registrants from literally all over the world, and we also have those joining with us here. I think I saw as far away as perhaps Texas, and we have folks in the surrounding Southeast area. That is, while there are many disadvantages to not having a face-to-face lecture series, one of the advantages is accessibility. And so that's great to see. And I know that many of you are here today may not join us if this was a conference that we were having on the campus. We do look forward, though, down the road of having campus experiences as we used to have. And so we will continue to do that. Once again, this is the Peter Ray and Ellen Jones New Testament lecture series made available by our beloved now retired scholar, Dr. Peter Ray Jones, who is both a New Testament scholar as well as a pastor. So he has, along with his wife, dealt in the emerging and shifting context of how do you live out this biblical tradition in the world in which we find ourselves. And so we're very grateful that he has been a champion of this series that we have as we have brought together scholars from around the world. I would not be doing my job as interim dean of this great school of theology if I did not say that I recognize many of you have completed degrees in theological education. But if you're open for continuing education, or if you've not completed a master's level or a doctoral level degree, we would love to talk with you. And so Nikki will place in the chat section a way to link with our admissions. We are very proud to be launching in addition to our residential degree programs on the master's and doctoral level, we're going to be offering a fully online Master of Divinity degree this coming fall. In fact, the response to that has been tremendous. Mercer University will be the first research university in the Southeast offering a fully online Master of Divinity program. So I want to encourage you, if you know someone that is looking for a school with theological integrity, this is a great place to make inquiry about how we can help equip you for the work that God has called you to do. One final way in which you can be a part of our School of Theology is through audits. And I look on this screen, many of you are auditing different classes. Not every class is available for audit, but many of them are. And speaking as one who also teaches some classes here, audits often greatly enrich the classroom experience. They help provide another voice for our students to learn from. And let's just face it, it's a very inexpensive way to accomplish continuing education units, ways in which you can grow in your scholarship as well as in your work. Now, enough about all of this. Let me proudly introduce two presenters today. Our keynote scholar that will be facilitating this is Professor Louise Lawrence. We're so delighted. We'll be seeing her in just a moment. She's on our screen here. She is Professor of New Testament Interpretation at the University of Exeter in Exeter, England. I've actually had the privilege of visiting that beautiful spot in the United Kingdom about 15 years ago on a sabbatical leave. She's done a number of incredible things in terms of publications of journals and presentations, as well as her ongoing academic work in Exeter. I want to hold before you her book published in 2013, Sense and Stigma in the Gospels, Depictions of Sensory Disabled Characters. For those of you on our campus, you can check this out in the library once I return it. But as an author, I know she would appreciate you purchasing this book. That's always better. And it is a fabulous book. I commend it to you. In fact, the conclusion is worth the cost of the book. So I want to commend this book to you. The bibliography is rich, it's thought-provoking, and it will be a valuable tool in your tool chest as you're developing a library. You also have, that is Professor Louise Lawrence has a forthcoming book out, I think this year, if not already, Compassionate Campuses, Refiguring the University in an Age of Neoliberalism. So we greatly await the publication of that book. Dr. Lawrence, we are so glad you're here with us. Welcome. Following Dr. Lawrence's first presentation, I'm just proud as can be to have one of our alum 2020 graduate, Reverend Becca Ray. She is a delightful human being, a fantastic thinker and scholar in her own right. She's a fabulous liturgist. I was always blown away in chapel services when she would write the responsive readings or the prayers. They were thoughtful, insightful, and thought-provoking, and greatly contributed to the overall body of experience here at McAfee. And speaking personally, we miss you, Becca. We're so glad you're here. She is living in Raleigh, North Carolina, and is seeking further opportunities to make genuine community and the resources therein accessible to all. We were teasing her earlier. I was teasing her earlier. If you're interested in hiring one of our wonderful graduates and you want someone that's intelligent, capable, imaginative, creative, Becca can make her resume available to you, virtually speaking. Just put it in the chat section. Your church or your nonprofit would be benefited by her. Y'all have heard already too much from me. We look forward to this conference. We're excited about it. Professor Lawrence, you're among friends. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dean DeLoach, and thank you to you and to Nikki and to Dr. Angela Parker for what's been such a lovely intro to your space, a compassionate campus. I really feel that Mercer is. We started this conversation just after Christmas, and every single engagement we've had has been so positive, full of humor, and so thank you. It already feels that you inhabit a warm community that I feel part of, so I'm very grateful. I'm also very aware that these Zoom calls provide lots of opportunities, but they also provide fatigue on the eyes, and people can zoom out. And so actually, rather than try and do this as a sage on a stage kind of encounter, I want us to work together. So rather than a lecture so much, I'm going to facilitate some conversations around the biblical text that I'm going to introduce. And that, of course, I invite you to please participate in those conversations. I will depend on it so that I don't have to talk all the time, and we can start to generate some ideas together. The title of the funded lecture is Reimagining Perfection. And perfection, or bodily perfection, is a contested term within disability studies, because perfection often for a body that has the kind of, and I use scare quotes a lot because disability is often a projection or a construction on a body. Often perfection from disability involves some sort of transformation, and not all kind of bodies would want cure or particular kind of transformation being put onto them. So we're going to look at two healing stories today. The first one we're going to look at in session one is on the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida, and then in the second session we're going to look at the healing of the man at the pool in John's Gospel. And we're going to think of them in many ways is compulsory cure or compulsory perfection what is at the center of these stories, or actually rather than physical perfection, we're actually looking at social mobility, and we're looking at inclusion as a category. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself and what I've been doing and how I got into this area. So I've always been very interested in advocacy approaches to New Testament studies, sort of feminism, post-colonial approaches. And one of the ways that marginalized communities often can resist some of the projections on them is to reconstruct the Bible and its interpretation in reference to their worldviews and experiences. And I did my PhD in Exeter, but then I worked in Scotland for a number of years. I worked at St Andrews and I worked at Glasgow University. And Glasgow University at the time had a key link with the Ujima Centre in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa that had modelled this process called contextual Bible study, which basically is what everyone probably does when they read the Bible, is that they bring something of their own experience to the text. And in the Ujima Centre, it was mainly to try and overcome the ways in which the Bible had been used for good and ill in the apartheid era. And whilst you wouldn't get resolution from groups working in communities and reading biblical texts, there would still be differences of opinions around how they were reading these texts. Nevertheless, the very fact that people that were in a sense sort of ideologically opposed or had been kind of working through trauma and past violence could actually sit around a text together was itself in some way cathartic. And we use this in Glasgow. I don't know if you know much about the west of Scotland, but it's an area that historically has had problems with religious sectarianism. It's often Catholics and Protestants. There is a very kind of uneasy relationship in that area. It's often shown more through football allegiance than it is, well, you call it soccer, I think, but football in Scotland. It was often sort of tribalism that young people would grow up kind of sort of having this idea of the other. And we used contextual Bible study as an approach which basically was sense over sectarianism. We looked at the ways in which boundaries kind of worked in the biblical material. And we tried to say, what are your experiences? You know, how have you felt in relation to your own context? And it's not that priests and professors could tell them the answer. Contextual Bible study very much says that every single person has libraries of experience, of life experience that they can bring to the text. So it's a democratizing process. So when I was thinking of disability liberation, I conducted a number of interpretations, contextual Bible study interpretations, with communities across the UK with various sensory disabilities, but also I've worked in the Hearing Voices Network for people that have what the medical model would call hallucinations or auditory kind of experiences. And often for these groups, their bodily experiences are seen as different, but not deviant. And therefore, we have to, in a sense, kind of think about, you know, how some of the narratives that we construct around experiences such as theirs can both liberate, but also can perpetuate oppression and exclusion. And this kind of process, I think, has worked really well. And I'm going to today show you not what the community groups did, although I will tell you a bit about that. I'm actually going to interchange our Bible stories with some disability performance art and activism, which is publicly available on YouTube. I did this specifically so that you, perhaps, if you wanted to introduce this to some of the communities in which you work, you would have that material available to you freely. Now, I think that the wonderful Nikki is going to help me with my slides, and she is going to share her screen on my behalf. So that would be amazing if you could do that, Nikki. Oh. That's brilliant. If you could just put it down to the next slide, please, Nikki. Thank you. So what is disability advocacy and activism? Well, in many ways, the liberating disability perspectives in religion and theology find their genesis in disability rights movements of the 1970s and 1980s, in which activists in both North America and in Europe started complaining against an exclusionary and discriminatory status quo. The Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990 and other allied reforms stimulated shifts in policies and attitudes towards disabilities in both the public sphere and in the academy and the church. And just as other kind of minoritized voices, feminist, queer, African-American, post-colonial, were starting to challenge the powerful privileged structures which oppress them, so an emergent disability studies developed strategies and practices to question and subvert what's been called the ableism, prejudice and societal attitudes which devalue those with perceived non-normative bodies. Could you pop the slide down, please, Nikki? So here we are, the definition of ableism. And through this kind of process, disability perspectives have not only exposed negative ways in which disability is often figured or characterized and presented within Judeo-Christian texts, traditions and interpretations, but they've also enabled disability experiences to refigure lots of the assumptions that we have when we read biblical texts and we think of biblical attitudes to bodies. Now, in disability studies, I'm not going to be too theory heavy, but just to give you a sense of what the three kind of models are that disability studies talks about. Again, if you could put the slide down, please, Nikki. Disability studies is an area and a discipline that spans a number of disciplines. You'll hear about it in social science, but also literature and religion. So it's very dispersed, but one thing that unites it is kind of the three lenses or models of disability that it understands it by. And the first one is the medical model of disability. This very much sees the body as the problem in many ways. If there is a normative idea of the body, an ideal body, and for some function or appearance of a body does not bring true to that ideal, often it is seen as in some way defective or often in need of normalization or cure or therapy. This is the dominant and often dominating perspective in modern Western contexts. The second model is the social model. That so much doesn't take the body as the problem, but actually the arenas, the social activities that the body is involved in. And in relation to biblical studies, the sort of physical, social, religious expectations around the body. This has been useful in biblical studies and theology because it's allowed the interpreter to engage and understand how social, political and religious conventions around bodies in particular times and places have censored, have kind of modelled and the infrastructure of how bodies interact. But actually, disability activism has kind of a problem with both of those models. The medical model, in a sense, talks at the body or talks beyond the person. The social model, in many ways, can talk over the person as well. And in a sense, it's where is the voice of experience? And the cultural or minority model of disability is much more what are the insider voices? How do we understand these kinds of experiences? And to give you one example, I've done a lot of work with the British deaf community. And for that community with a capital D, they would not see themselves as a community that are marked by an experience of not being able to hear. They would much more see themselves as a minority language community, a community that has BSL as their primary language, and that in a sense they have a history, a heritage, stories and experiences and cultural values around food and jokes and humor, and a whole kind of almost like an ethnic group that have a whole rich, enriching history. And that kind of analysis just doesn't come out in a medical or a social model of deafness. And it was this third model that I tried to do when I did contextual Bible studies within communities. And it should be said, of course, that like any advocacy perspective, you cannot speak on behalf of every person that is within your group. Everyone brings their own library. You know, you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, you haven't met the entire group. And so in a sense, it's kind of, it's very contextual, it's very fluid. And in my work and trying to write up what groups have said, in many ways, it's often the voices which challenge the norms that are the ones that are the most sort of startling for thinking about ableism and how we can reread biblical texts. Okay, if you'd just like to put the screen down again, please, Nikki. Now, I'm not sure if I can actually see the chat at the same time, or if anybody indeed can see the chat at the same time. Dean Deloach, can you see the chat? If people in the chat, please put 3 words which sum up biblical views of disability. Would you be able to tell me some of them, or if people can actually?
Yeah, I'll be glad to.
Oh, I can see them now. That's brilliant. Okay, so if people would like to, in the chat, put 3 words up which sum up to you what you perhaps biblical views of disability are.
Did you want me to read them out, or will you do that?
Well, I can see now because
okay.
Nikki stopped sharing the screen. Okay, so we have healing, demonization, wholeness. Okay, something to be fixed, exclusionary, less than whole, broken, shunned, outsider. Wow, they're really powerful words. Punishment. Okay, yeah. Sinful, exiled, shunned, incomplete. Wow. Miracle, grotesque. Yeah, there's a whole kind of thing of sort of freak showness that disability studies talks about, the kind of the ableist gaze that kind of looks at these figures and makes assumptions about them. Impure, lame, other, sinful. Yeah, these are all really powerful words, and they're often quite negative. If Nikki, you could share your screen again, sorry again. Makes Jesus look good. I like that one. There's a thing in disability studies called narrative prosthesis, which basically is a posh word that says often disabled characters in the Gospels are just bit parts. They're kind of in introductions and they're in conclusions. They're not of interest in themselves. It's the plot of which they're a part that is of interest. And often the plot is messianic healing. And so, yeah, making Jesus look good can be one of them. If you can just put the screen down, please, to the next slide. So we had very powerful kind of words, which I think sum up some of the ableist biblical and theological dynamics that we see within the biblical tradition. So often if we think of what a normate or ideal body is within that context, we often think of, you know, for the Hebrew Bible, it's a male, circumcised, fecund, pure, non-disabled body. So in a sense, to be non-Jewish or to be a woman is to be disabled in that context. In the New Testament too, I think that masculinity is a very key sort of ideal body. And those bodies that are seen for whatever reason to fall short of ability and physical kind of normality are subject to a whole range of stigmas. Stigma is a word that came from anthropology. It was literally a mark that was put on people, often criminals or often, you know, people on the underside of society, and they would literally be marked, their whole identity being subsumed under that condition. And when we think of talking about the blind man or the deaf man, in a sense, their whole identity is taken over by their disability. So we often get deviance labeling within the Gospels. So for instance, John 9, when faced with the blind man, the disciples asked, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So a sort of significant equation between disability and sinfulness, or a disability and sort of not keeping to accepted social norms. We often also see the symbol of disability for spiritual ineptitude, you know, ears that don't hear, eyes that don't see the true nature of spiritual kind of insight. Saul Olian's done some great work in the Hebrew Bible on how rhetoric around idols often uses sensory and disability metaphors. You know, so, you know, idols, unlike the super-able Yahweh, the idols can't see and they can't walk around on their own. They are disabled. And for disability studies, there is a sense in which compulsory able-bodiedness, particularly in the Gospels, is an unquestioned norm. John Hull, who I'm going to talk about in a moment, famously said, you know, everyone is healed to join the Jesus Club. Everyone is normalized. Everyone has this curative imaginary. And for disability studies, compulsory cure is in some way, not for everybody, of course, but for some, you know, on the more radical end, it's almost a kind of assumption of terror, where you can't imagine a future where disability is included. It can only be eliminated or normalized. And so actually the biblical texts aren't sort of straight kind of liberation narratives in the way that perhaps ableism would have them. They're quite difficult. Now, of course, disability theology has done really interesting things in relation to the picture of God. So Nancy Iseland has seen God in a sit-puff wheelchair as a God that breathes life, but isn't kind of a super able, omniscient, these kind of qualities which capitalist neoliberal contexts want us to say, you work, therefore you are. God as survivor, God as broken, God as tortured on the cross are very key theological kind of evocative disability symbols. But actually these healing narratives are really hard to kind of think in a more liberating way. And so I want us to spend half an hour now looking at a particular text from Mark and thinking about some of the ways in which we can perhaps reimagine perfection, not as the rejection of disability or the elimination of disability, but something which sits more kind of positively with that experience. So if you could put the slide down, please, Nikki. Okay. Blindness as a category has often in Western cultures been used metaphorically. And I've got two examples of that. Well, actually, if you look up the Oxford English Dictionary, it says the following: blind, unable to see, lacking perception, awareness, or judgment, a blind acceptance of the status quo. That dictionary definition very quickly goes from a particular impairment or sightlessness to an ideological, this means that you can't see, a blind acceptance of the status quo. And actually, the reception history of biblical texts around blindness, I think, have a lot to contribute to that whole association. So on the left-hand side here, you have a picture from a Byzantine sarcophagus, literally flesh eater, a place where bodies would be put until the bones had rotted, until the flesh had rotted, and then the bones would be collected. Used very much in early Christianity and early Christian history. What do you notice about that sarcophagi? It is a picture of the healing of the blind. What do you notice? Perhaps you can shout out to me. Or wave your hand so Nikki can unmute you.
I notice all the children.
Okay, yes, tell me more. Who do you think they are? They're small. Yeah, someone else has seen that. So the blind men in this sarcophagi are all small. What is that sort of saying? Less than, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Do you notice anything about the comparison between the small blind people's dress and the disciples and Jesus? Undeveloped, less dressed, yeah. One of them is naked, absolutely. There is a sense, I think, I mean, needy, yeah, absolutely. They're sort of seen as passive. They are small and infantilized, but I think it's not so much, they aren't looking at the blind. Yes, indeed, they're looking at one another, fantastic. And they're dressed almost in senatorial kind of dress. They are dressed as wise men, and the naked and sort of much more simply dressed blind people are much more seen as the lower echelons of society. There's a whole kind of hierarchical kind of conception of the blind. And also, what's the metaphorical association going on here? Because the healing of the blind is actually a really common trope to be put onto sarcophagi. So what is the connection being made there? One of the blinds appears to have climbed up to see what the disciples see. Yeah. Actually, the chap on the right-hand side is actually the raising of Lazarus. So you've got kind of another miracle story on there. But absolutely, the hierarchy is something. Blindness is a type of death. Fantastic. Yes. So you have this metaphorical association. The only hope for the blind people is an otherworldly afterlife. Healing, because this world is, and I can't read it all because it's not on my screen, but absolutely have this link between death and blindness, and normalization, perfection in the resurrection, presumably includes these people to be able to see the light, see the living, and also to perhaps join this kind of educated senatorial class that the disciples and Jesus are kind of representing. Fantastic. On the right-hand side, you have two figures, and these actually doublets are very key on a number of different architectural elements, but this one's from the cathedral at Strasbourg, and it's called Ecclesia and Synagogue. What's going on here? What do you notice about these two figures, and how is the metaphor of blindness operating in relation to both? Any thoughts? Shout out, type. Ecclesia is eye opened. There's a broken staff with the blind. Yes, absolutely. The church, ecclesia, is the one with the crown, with the chalice, looking towards, you know, a vision, looking straight. Synagogue is blindfolded and looking disheveled, and she holds a Torah on the left-hand side. It's a very problematic image. It's a supersessionist, anti-Jewish kind of image, but it was very key in sort of, you know, showing that, in a sense, you know, in the light of these kinds of metaphors, then Judaism is somehow, you know, doesn't have the clear vision that Christianity does, and a supersessionist kind of model was put here. So blindness, again, associated with less clear kind of vision, less clear leadership. And I want to suggest that actually many of these metaphors were perpetuated by biblical material. So if you can put the slide down again, please, Nikki. Okay, we're going to look at the narrative of the blind man from Bethsaida. Do I have a volunteer to read this text out for us, please?
I can do that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Zena.
Sure. Mark 8:22 through 26.
Yes, please.
They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village."
Thank you so much, Zena. That was wonderful. So I have 3 questions here, and in many ways they are questions like ones that I would use in my contextual Bible study material. They wouldn't have used the cultural minority model of disability. I normally say, what jumps out of the page at you, and what kind of chimes with your experience, and what annoys you about this text, and what do you feel is kind of inclusive about this text. But I've done it in a bit more posh kind of academic way for this afternoon. So I've got 3 questions I'd like some input on. So first of all, we're going to think about in what ways are the characters and disabilities presented here. So either in the chat, or if you want to contribute orally, that's fine too. What are kind of the things that jump out at the page at you in relation to this character? Even healed, the blind man is still excluded and removed from the village. Yes, indeed, the kind of inclusion is denied. And that sometimes happens at the end of healing stories. Another good example is the Legion narrative. He had to be brought by other people and begging. Yes, there's a kind of sense of a passivity about this character, at least in the outset, led by the hand. The blind man wasn't the one, oh gosh, there's so much going on in the chat. I need to put it this way. The blind man wasn't the one asking to be healed. It specifically says some people brought in him. Yes, fantastic. Yeah, it's interesting. In the blind man with Bartimaeus, Jesus says to him, what do you want me to do for you? But actually in Bethsaida, you're right, it's almost like the consent is taken away. He's not named. No, indeed he's not. And there are very few gospel characters that are named, that are healed. Do you only see disability in the man from Bethsaida, or is it a category that perhaps applies to any other character? Yeah, we can say Jesus. Tell me more, Angela. Can you unmute yourself? The healing doesn't work the first time. Indeed. This is the only place we have a healing twice. Yeah, Angela, tell me more.
Yeah, the healing doesn't work the first time. So it's almost as if Jesus is unable to heal him.
Yeah, okay. We haven't got this instantaneous kind of cure, which we've come to expect in gospel healing narratives. So there's something curious and strange going on with this. There is inability that is kind of related to a number of different characters. And I think Amelia and Becca have picked up that as well. Okay, so we've talked about agentlessness, we've talked about passivity. Any other qualities that you would perhaps see in relation to particularly the Bethsaida character? Boundaries are lacking, says Diana. Tell me more. Do you want to unmute yourself, Diana? Oh, trying. We're all disabled by Zoom.
Okay. Hey, sorry. Just to preface, I have a disabled daughter, and often I think that there's this expectation that people can maybe touch her, talk to her in a different way than they wouldn't with other children. Babying.
So again,
the word touchy. The word touchy comes a little bit, even the ways that sometimes doctors, as well as much as they mean to, I think they mean dignity, the way they pull on her and just say things out loud in front of her, like this side of the body is much smaller than the other. And the lack of, I mean, everything about interaction sometimes lacks. I just think the word boundaries very often.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a really key insight. And many of Jesus's healings are quite tactile and touchy, and as you say, the kind of consent element is really, really important on that.
Just imagine how much this person is being touched during this interaction. It's incredible.
Yeah.
And I think in every time, I think boundaries are something innate that we can feel when they're off. You can ask a small 2-year-old and they can tell when it's off. So.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Thank you. Okay, let's think about blindness and metaphor. In your sort of experience of this text, and commentaries sort of talk almost in unison on this point, in what ways has blindness been used metaphorically in interpretations of this story? How has this story been read? Who has this character been seen to mirror, or what are the kind of virtues or lack of kind of virtues that this character is seen to embody?
I often see this text read alongside, it's read kind of in a come to Jesus service. It's a, I once was blind, but now I see. Yeah. And this is often what people like to use.
Absolutely. And that very ableist kind of metaphor is very key. And as you say, it happens in liturgy and in songs and in preaching around this kind of text. I think he's often been read in commentaries very much as kind of symbolizing a 2-stage of understanding or misunderstanding. And often, if you remember in Mark's sandwich structures in the gospel, he often has 2 echoed stories, but then the middle story becomes the kind of keynote that you can understand the other 2 by. So this is actually the second blind healing within Mark. We also have blind Bartimaeus, but in the middle, those 2 blind healings are the kind of inclusios of the major story, which is the enlightenment or misunderstanding of Peter. So we have the Caesarea Philippi, who do you say I am, as the kind of center point. And this character, in many commentaries for this reason, has been read almost like as a kind of mirror metaphor of Peter's misunderstanding. So in a sense, it's not only the blindness that becomes metaphorical. This poor chap's whole identity is swallowed up by just mirroring the kind of proto-apostle. And if you remember in that encounter at Caesarea Philippi, Peter, you know, who do you say I am? You are the Messiah. But then he misunderstands what that messiahship involves. He misunderstands that this involves the cross, and it doesn't involve kind of sort of conquering through messianic war or uproar. And because of that, people have said this image perhaps mirrors some of that misunderstanding, you know, a certain enlightenment but still blindness. What do you think, therefore, that a sort of disability advocacy perspective from the cultural minority model may make of this story? Both positively or negatively. I think that Diana's point about consent and touch was really an important kind of sorry, I'm getting a cup of tea while I'm sat in. That's a good thing about working at home. Your husband brings you tea. Any thoughts on cultural minority model? Well, I'm gonna help you out a little bit. The idea of like the other people are resources to be used. Trees. I love that, Amelia. This is brilliant. Yes, the trees element are really, really interesting. And I will come back to those in a moment. I'm going to, can you put the slide down, please, Nikki? And I'm going to introduce you to two cultural minority voices of blindness. One of them, I don't know if you've heard of this chap, John Hull. He's wrote a fantastic book. I would, you know, say read his book. If you read anything on disability, In the Beginning There Was Darkness is his book. He was a New Testament professor at Queen's Foundation in Birmingham in the UK. He was born sighted. He did his bookish industry of New Testament studies, a very text literate sighted industry. We even talk about the window of the text, looking behind the text. Everything is very sight centric in New Testament studies. And at 40, he lost his sight. So this memoir is very much a kind of almost a grief memoir of the loss of sight. But he, in his, well, he did two very interesting things. The first thing was that this was happening in the 80s and the 90s, and he did an audio recording of his kind of experiences of losing sight and losing his ability to interact with books and the Bible in the same way. So he talks about going and smelling books in libraries, sort of the materiality of books that were lost to him, not being able to read books, having to see them through audio, where the voice would kind of make pauses in places where he wouldn't. But he also, for the first time, he says, engages with the biblical material and healing narratives as a blind man, and very much for the first time sees a sighted saviour. And he writes a very powerful letter to Jesus, who he addresses as the sighted saviour. This is available online. You can read the whole lot of it, but it's very, very powerful. Dear Jesus, according to the gospel, you use blind as a term of abuse. When you are attacking certain groups of people, you describe them as blind guides, blind fools. You have given your authority to those down the ages who have disparaged others through reference to visual loss. When I discuss these sayings with your sighted priests and other well-meaning friends, they defend you by pointing out that your use of the expression blind is only metaphorical. But I cannot understand how this is supposed to help. In general, the Gospels show you as being sensitive and attentive to blind people. But the problem is created precisely by the metaphorical use of blindness to suggest ignorance, stupidity, and insensitivity. He does go on to say that Jesus, as a sighted saviour, participates in blindness only once, but it's actually in a context of abuse in the crucifixion narrative. He is blindfolded by his execution team. But he also says that blindness is problematized in resurrection life, because on the road to Emmaus, the sighted disciples don't recognize who Jesus is. And when he breaks bread and they do finally recognize who Jesus is, actually at that point, they lose sight of him. And he said, so there is an ambiguity around sight and meaning. With his audio recordings, actually, John Hull, they've made an art house film called Notes on Blindness. It's publicly available. It has John Hull's voice, and I worked with John Hull when I was writing Sense and Stigma. I went up to Birmingham and stayed with him for a little while, and it's so lovely to hear his voice in this film. So we're going to watch just a small clip of this Notes on Blindness, if all the tech works, which I'm grateful to Nikki for.
This is cassette 1, track 1, Notes on Blindness. July the 5th, 1984. What happens to the brain when optics...
We're not seeing the actual film.
I think Nikki will, when the film opens, I think Nikki then has to go to that place and share that.
Forgive me, I had too many windows. It'll take me just a moment.
None of us are going to take your job away from you on this video thing, Nikki.
This is cassette 1, track 1, Notes on Blindness. July the 5th, 1984. What happens to the brain when optic stimulation ceases? I am concerned to understand blindness. The pictures in the gallery of my mind have dimmed somewhat, so I could no longer remember easily what my wife looked like, or what my daughter Imogen looked like.
I began to be terribly afraid that I would lose you.
Everything was drifting away. How could this happen to me? Who had the right to deprive me of the sight of my children at Christmas time?
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Nikki. That's fine. Okay, so John Hull is a very, a very key kind of story of grief, I suppose, in loss of sight. Our second example is Georgina Cleage, who is who is a English literature professor who for many years passed as sighted. But actually, when she wrote her biography, Sight Unseen, which is a very clever title, she talks about the ways her first line is, "Writing this book made me blind." So she uses a white stick for the first time. She uses Braille for the first time in front of her students, because she feels that actually they, that she's passed as normal to before them, and so she wants to try and embrace her blind identity, not as something other, but as something part of herself. And she's very interesting because she was the daughters of two artists, one a sculptor, one a painter, a very visual kind of culture. But she talks about how the sighted can be very naive about what sight can bring you. She says you only need to be in a station to say hello to someone and then think, oh, it's not them. I'm sorry I said that. Your eyes can deceive you. Seeing isn't believing. And also how when she talked about, she had an uneasy relationship with her father that she talks about in this memoir. But actually she feels her father's sculptures with his hands around her. And she said that actually that touch disabled hierarchy. It made connection. Now, going back to our story in Mark, she would say that actually rather than Jesus saying, tell me what you see, as in, tell me what your blindness sees, but rather, what do you see? Is there something in that encounter that actually the blind man is able to tell Jesus? And a guy called Duncan Derritt has done some really interesting work on the blind man from Bethsaida. And those trees walking, I think somebody said it was like people. This is brilliant because actually there is no, in ancient literature, there is no other parallel of that saying at all. People are a bit flummoxed by what it means. But looking like trees walking, people have said, does that look like armies walking? So when you think about Peter's idea of a conquering Messiah, is this armies walking? And then, no, that's not how we're going to conquer. It's through submission and then the sight it sees. But actually, taking Georgina Clege's insight, I think we can read that text in a different way. Tell me what you see. What do trees represent elsewhere in biblical tradition? Trees represent a lot, but particularly in relation to the Christian story, I suppose, or being taken up. Life, yeah, okay, so you have the tree of life in Eden, the tree of knowledge as well. Yeah, knowledge and wisdom, okay. What about where a tree actually becomes a shameful symbol? The cross, indeed, indeed. Could it be, tell me what you see? What do you see? Perhaps we see those people, I forget who said the people walking, but Amelia, I think, the people walking, the crosses walking. It could be that the blind man, rather than being a siphon of inability, misunderstanding, actually becomes a cipher of understanding. And it's interesting that even though those commentators that want to see blindness associated with demonic possession, the only people that recognize Jesus' true identity and speak the truth in the Gospel of Mark are who? It's not until the cross that a human figure says, truly this man was the Son of God. Who are the voices that know who he is? Know exactly the demons, indeed. So actually you have a very different refiguring of the narrative where the metaphorical link between misunderstanding and blindness can in fact, through Clege, be broken somewhat, and that the blind metaphor can be upturned, that Jesus actually becomes part of the ways in which this narrative kind of generates new insight. I am on 5 o'clock, so I need to, you're not on 5 o'clock, I'm on 5 o'clock in my time, you're on some other time over in the pond, but I need to stop because this is my first session over. But thank you so much for all your participation, and thank you, Nikki, for doing the slide.
So thank you, Dr. Louise Lawrence. I really, can you hear me? Okay. I really appreciate everything that you have unpacked for us, especially in the marking context. A few things jumped out at me that I hope we can begin to segue as we segue to Becca Ray, giving us a response from her perspective, her personal perspective. And we thank you, Becca, for agreeing to do your personal perspective. I'm just so much, I think, stunned by a few phrases. Passed as sighted by Georgina Cleage. So the idea of passing as a sighted person, it just takes me to passing as white or passing as Christian or passing as heterosexual. And so this advocacy work, the language does transfer to a lot of different groups. And even going back before, the idea of naming, you talked about the capital D deaf community that you were working with and the ability to name themselves and to name themselves as a minority language community, which is so helpful on so many other fronts as well, because I began to think about how we talk about our migrant communities and how we talk about crossing boundaries and what that looks like, especially with regards to language. So if we began to put together in our brains just the way that language helps with how we begin to advocate for many groups of people, I see solidarity building across identities. And I think that's what I'm kind of picking up on. How do we build solidarity across boundaries? And how can that build, how instead of thinking about, I'm my particular identity, you're your particular identity, this is this particular identity, what it looks like to begin to think about solidarity across identities that actually bridges communities and bridges together advocacy among so many different communities, and why we're all so important to one another's struggle. That's the thing. I think oftentimes, well, it's my struggle and you're not a part of my struggle. Well, no, we're all a part of similar struggles. And so how that language goes through, that's wonderful. And then, of course, the masculine as the ideal body. I wish so many of my New Testament students were in here thinking through this, because now they don't think I'm the one who made something up. I'm just telling them about the scholarship that's out there about masculinity as the ideal. So some of those threads were coming together for me as you were beginning to, as you were going from one part to the next. And so I really do appreciate just the naming of ourselves, what it means for solidarity building across different and various oppressions, and how we can actually do some great work together if we listen to one another and how different people name themselves and talk about themselves, as opposed to using a medical model or a social model, but thinking through more of a cultural minority model of disability. So I just want to say thank you. And I'm ready to hear now Becca's perspective from this wonderful presentation that you've given us. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Professor Lawrence. And that's a great segue, Dr. Parker, because the reality is the disability rights movement and the civil rights movement are inextricably linked. When the original kind of Section 504 sit-in was happening in Oakland, California, the Black Panthers were bringing meals for these disabled people who were sitting in an administrative building for 27 days. And so inextricably, there has always been solidarity between those two communities. And personally, what gave me the theological language to start explaining kind of my experience was reading Howard Thurman, Jesus and the Disinherited. And so I think the language that we use is also inextricably linked. So thank you for that. And thanks to Mercer, to Dr. DeLoach and Nikki for inviting me back to speak today. And thank you to Professor Lawrence. It's an honor to be presented beside her. She's done a lot of good work that I certainly had the pleasure of reading up on before this conference. And I noticed in a recent monograph, she wrote that in the pages of the Gospels, characters with disabilities are curiously everywhere and nowhere. And I want us to sit with that for just a moment, because the reality is that in our churches, in our congregations, in our communities, and around the globe, disabled people are curiously everywhere and nowhere. Disabled people are one of the country's largest minority groups, making up 26% of the US population. 1 in 4 adults in the US has a disability. And those are just the ones that the CDC has identified and counted. We are everywhere. Not always with a wheelchair, not always with a noticeable handicap, but we are prolific indeed. And yet, we are nowhere. We are overlooked both literally and figuratively in most discussions of diversity. To the public eye, we virtually did not exist until 1989, when deinstitutionalization occurred. The Americans with Disabilities Act was not passed until 1990, 5 short years before I was born, thanks to my predecessors who crawled up the steps of the Capitol and did not relent until their civil rights legislation was guaranteed. Over 30 years have passed, and disabled people are still, curiously, everywhere and nowhere. You may see us represented in a parking space or a specially marked door. If you're lucky, you may witness a ramp or 2. But the reality is, even after 3 decades, accessibility is most often an afterthought. Judy Heumann, who is one of the leaders of the disability rights movement, put it, "I still find myself thankful for an accessible bathroom. And as long as I have to be thankful for an accessible bathroom, I will still not feel a part of this community. With every curb with no cut, street devoid of sidewalk, and bathroom just up the stairs to the left, I'm reminded that the world was not built for me." So what does this mean theologically? The truth of the matter is that conventional Christian theology also fails to account for the disabled body. We may discuss all day in our ivory towers why God would let grand episodes of evil plague this world. But our ivory towers are not equipped with elevators. There is not a ramp for the disabled person to connect the overarching theological narrative to their lived experience on the ground floor. Instead, the disabled body is a plot device used to inspire a difficult situation we can use to emphasize the glory of God. I caught on to this really early in life. When I was about 3, my mother took me to a public pool, and a woman came up to her and said, "It's nice that you get her out." I could read by age 4, and by age 6, I was reading healing narratives, like the one we just discussed, and asking God, when would it be my turn? I was told that God made me this way, but I was never satisfied with that answer. And so began my ongoing dialogue with the divine. "Your faith has made you well," Jesus said. How much more faith did I have to be made well? In the meantime, I would be reminded by church folks that in heaven you'll be able to walk, run, and jump, which read to me as, "You'll feel better when you're dead." I would be lauded as an inspiration anytime I came into church with a less supportive mobility aid. So think like crutches instead of a walker. A change undoubtedly dictated by a doctor who wanted to make sure I, quote, "didn't get lazy," which was a common approach to cerebral palsy in that era, An approach that said all of this pain was for my benefit, and if I did not endure it, I wouldn't be able to walk at all, which was painted to be the worst circumstance in the entire world. Any conventional accomplishment, like graduating high school or even a trip to the gym in the morning, gets noticed by passerby who thank me for my bravery and for essentially daring to exist. It comes as no surprise then that most, if not all, of the disabled activists I know do not go to church. Churches are, after all, not required to comply with the ADA. If they do, it is often at the request of elderly congregation members who are themselves becoming disabled, as all able-bodied folks will, with age. And if disabled people can get in the door, they are often met in the halls with platitudes, offered to be prayed over, assumed to be devoid of meaningful desires, and unable to contribute to church life. I do not blame my disabled colleagues for leaving or never approaching the church, because you see, there's too much at stake. Sociological research demonstrates that the disabled person is most often perceived as already dead. Studies show that parents of disabled children go through the stages of grief. Yes, those stages of grief that we're familiar with after someone has died. You may have heard it said at a baby shower, as long as the baby is healthy. Which begs the question, but what if it isn't? There are two important pieces of grief in this situation. One is anger. We are quick to assume that disability is someone's fault. For the religious family, this often means that they get angry at God, confounded after months of prayer for a healthy baby. And as time goes on, this anger turns into a lingering depression as parents come to terms with their child's potential limitations. More significantly here, though, is bargaining. It is the most dangerous phase of grief in this situation, because the family of a disabled person sets out on a constant, relentless journey to alleviate their child's suffering. And there's a fine line between treatment for functionality and falling into this pattern of bargaining. Because parents will spend copious amounts of time and money on surgeries or experimental treatments, many that may only provide results in the short term. These children are then shuffled from one doctor to another in desperate attempts to find healing. So excuse us if we don't want any more suggestions on a Sunday morning. But I honestly come from a position of privilege in this respect. My father is a physician and my mother a former special educator. So they were prepared to adequately acknowledge the biological, neuromuscular nature of my disability that makes it non-progressive, but ultimately non-curable. They have always pushed me to be my best, no matter the endeavor, and for that I am grateful. They did, however, forget to tell me that Forrest Gump was a fictional movie, so I did spend some time trying to run out of my braces. It's okay for you to laugh at that. It's funny. This grief and its resulting mishaps are the results of medicine framing disability as a deficit, as Professor Lawrence pointed out. But on some level, our primary human instinct is that disability is a deficit. Survival of the fittest, they would say. I fully embrace science and all of its developments, but I do so cautiously aware that some scientific progress has been made at the expense of disabled bodies. I grew up learning about Dolly the sheep and fresh discoveries ever revealing how someday we could create the perfect human. It wasn't until my high school years that I became uncomfortable with these developments. For example, I was part of the YMCA Youth in Government program, meaning I took part in a simulated House and Senate for an entire week every year for 4 years. And every year, a physician-assisted suicide bill would come into question. As someone diagnosed with depression and anxiety at age 14, I understood the emotional weight behind this policy, and I understood the logic that this legislation operates on. At the same time, it was my first crystal clear indicator that the disabled body was perceived as a disposable one. My sophomore year of high school, we did a short unit on the bioethics of DNA science, including watching the film Gattaca. If you don't want spoils, if you don't want spoilers for Gattaca, you can close your ears, but this included watching Gattaca set in a world where perfect humans could be engineered. At the end of the film, the one character in a wheelchair rolls himself into an incinerator. You can unplug your ears if you were plugging them before. Yeah, I know Gattaca's so important to so many people. That was sarcasm if you couldn't tell. But yes, so now during a deadly pandemic that is claiming people, disabled people in disproportionate numbers, I hear echoes of only the weak will die, and we should strive for herd immunity. Fun fact, herd immunity is yet another medical phenomenon that is derived from the eugenics movement. I never expected in my mid-20s to plan for a scenario in case I end up on a ventilator, but here we are. Such is the world of a disabled person. No matter their age, success, education, or occupation, they will find reminders large and small about what the world, including Christians, thinks of them. Or perhaps more appropriately, that the world does not and would rather not think of them. Some would say that I must have tremendous faith to endure my testimony and still be faithful, an ordained minister even. Similarly, cancer survivors are lauded for never complaining, and people going through medical crises are saints for always having a smile on their face. Christians are pressured to handle disability in a spiritual way, and I am expected to be either a vegetable or a superhuman with little room in between. And I still argue with God about it to this day. On my first mission trip out of the country, it took one embarrassing phone call to explain that my dad was coming with me because he wanted to. And no, I can dress and bathe myself just fine. Thank you. My application to the Christian camp I dreamed of working for as a camper was rejected on the sole basis I was physically unable to obtain lifeguard certification, even though the respective position did not necessarily entail a body of water. During my missionary internship, I was asked to transfer countries mid-summer because the organization felt misled regarding my mobility concerns. A week after moving to Atlanta for seminary, I was hit by a car due to a vehicle blocking the ramp to the sidewalk. All this while, as some would say, in the service of the Lord. And I certainly did not have a smile on my face the entire way. I am here because I responded to my suffering with study. I recognize this contrast between my life circumstances, what God promises, and what the church teaches. And somehow, instead of walking away, I remained and I dug deeper. But there are disabled people everywhere, treated like they are nowhere, who do not have the time, energy, or privilege to dig in the way that I have. No one has all the answers, but the disability community deserves better ones than our common interpretations of Scripture can offer. So consider this your invitation to reimagine perfection. And in doing so, recognize the growing prevalence of imperfections, some that you see and some invisible to the naked eye. If your imagination of perfection doesn't include disability, try again. Because disability is not perfect or convenient, but it is everywhere. Widen your doorways, ready your ramps, and clear a pathway. Give imperfect bodies a reason to step in the door. Thank you.
If we were in a lecture hall, this would be I think a thunderous round of applause cascading from Professor Louise Lawrence's fine presentation to Dr. Angela Parker's helping puzzle out particularities, and of course from the theologian in praxis from Becca Ray. Thank you. I got nothing, so all I'm going to just simply say is let us continue on this incredibly thoughtful dialogue and journey. I think we're all feeling very filled with ideas and reimagining what could be. So again, thank you, Becca.
My pleasure.
Thank you for your contributions. Professor Lawrence, I'm going to turn it back to you for the second and final session of this.
Thank you. I feel that Becca should do the next hour because she was just amazing. Thank you, Becca, for such a powerful sharing of your story. And yeah, my goodness me, so many things. I hated the image of the ivory tower without the elevators, and a compassionate university should always have access in various ways. And the ivory tower, of course, is exclusionary all sorts of ways. It's white. It looks down upon people. It's got a whole lot of problems. And I think that higher education needs to unpick some of those privileges in a very particular kind of way. Okay, well, for the next session, we're going to look at another biblical text from the Gospel of John. It's the man at the pool in John 5. And if Nikki, if you would mind kindly sharing my slide, that would be amazing. Thank you very much indeed. So if you'd like to put it down to the first slide, please. Oh, 2 slides down there. That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I think Becca had put in the chat actually about Crypt Culture and Crypt resources. So I'm really grateful to Becca for doing that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Crypt Culture now. It is now over 2 decades since David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder, who are almost the ends of disability studies and discourses, filmed and produced their documentary called Vital Signs, Crypt Culture Talks Back. It was released in 1995, and you there have the one of the promotional posters for that film. Viewers variously in this film encounter Ellie Clare's poetry on cerebral palsy. I practiced the sounds th, sh, sl for years, says Ellie Clare. A pianist playing endless hours of scales. I had to learn the muscles of my tongue. Carrie Sandel, who you see here on the poster, dressed in white scrubs, the clothing of the medical profession, but covered in red writing as if etched in blood, cataloguing all of the medical notes that her body had evoked, scars, insensitive questions that her body had prompted in others, and she wrote them all on her clothing that you could almost read her body as a symbol of some of the assumptions made about it. And Mary Duffy's naked representation of Venus de Milo, echoing the highest echelons of Western art and culture, whilst provocatively questioning what she said, the reduction of her body to congenital malformation. It's a really, really powerful documentary film. These strong, intense and arresting performances are critically interspersed in Vital Signs with historical activist footage, including the Capitol Hill crawl in 1990, where hundreds left wheelchairs and crutches behind to physically pull themselves up steps to lobby for the Americans with Disabilities Act. We had similar protests in the UK. If, you know, voting booths are often put in primary schools or in town halls, which in the 60s, 70s, 80s often had steps going up to them. And it was a very powerful symbol that your civilian right, as in a democracy, was taken away from you. The access was not there. So Vital Signs is one example of an early example of what's called Crypt Culture, a visceral rewriting of the way that we understand and think about disability. It unpicks what the ideal body involves, and it gives voices to lived experiences of disability. Crip, like queer, was once a deviant label, cripple, imposed by others, often as a prejudicial language. But in Crypt culture, as in queer theory, this is subversively reappropriated, and it's charged and politicized as a kind of inclusive term. Alison Kafer has said, the harshness of crip as a word is a large part of its appeal because it jolts people out of their normal understandings of body and mind, of normalcy and deviance. Crip and cripple, she says, are words to help forge politics. So crip theory has been used somewhat in biblical studies, although far less so than some of the more well-known advocacy perspectives and theoretical perspectives. But I'm going to try today to think about some of the insights of Crypt culture in relation to the John 5 text. So if Nikki, if you'd like to put down the slide for me. Brilliant, thank you so much. Could I have another volunteer to read this text, please?
I'll read it.
Fantastic, thank you, Tiffany.
John 5, 1 through 18. After this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool called in Hebrew Bethsaida, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that it had been a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your mat." But he answered them, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is this man who said to you, 'Take it up and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared in the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Therefore, the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is still working, and I also am working." For this reason, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God his own. I can't see if there's anything else below it.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Tiffany. Calling God his own Father, therefore making himself equal to God. Thank you for beautiful reading. Okay, in the kind of style of contextual Bible study, what jumps out at the page at you? What kind of ways are the characters and disabilities presented here? Please either speak or put your reactions within the chat. Do not sin anymore implies that his sin causes his disability. Yes, absolutely. There's kind of a stigmatizing of that. It's a lonely reality. Yes, it's a story that very much zooms down on this one individual that seems isolated from a community. The term invalid, or literally invalid, speaks of the association with death that they're ripped off. They're not valid human beings. Absolutely, absolutely. There's a sense in which humanity is kind of lost from this figure. Other thoughts on this figure? He's alone within the community, which is a competitive system of healing. Yes, indeed. If you were going to put this as a performance on the stage, it's actually a very busy scene with lots of people, but the isolation of this individual is really startling. Yeah, and there, as you say, a competitive kind of need for people to be put into the water that really isn't using this excuses, using his disability as a barrier to getting his healing. That's a really interesting one, Yvonne. Do you want to say, do you feel confident enough to say anything about a bit more on that one? Using disability as a barrier to getting his healing? Healthcare for profit, yeah, very, very key.
I was thinking in terms of the reason why he couldn't get in the water. He couldn't get into the water. He said as he was going, someone would always get in front of him. And I saw that as an excuse, as a creative way he could have gotten to the water. Here is your opportunity to walk, to be healed. And you let a few people jump in front of you.
It's a very powerful image of steps too, like the Capitol Hill crawl, isn't it? In many ways, it's kind of a stepped image of access and in a sense, what would it take for that person to be able to access that material or access that pool? But yeah, thank you very much. Competitive system of healing also describes healthcare for it. My mind always goes to the other many people sitting around the pool. We don't hear if they're healed or not. No, indeed we don't. The silent masses everywhere but nowhere, the disability that is everywhere and nowhere. And the unseen among the masses. Thank you. Yeah. Come be healed, just walk down into this water that comes above your head if you crawl. Absolutely. Yeah, the non-accessibility of this. Well, with very few exceptions, if you read about this narrative in biblical commentaries, you would see this character being depicted in primarily negative terms. There is a way in which his kind of the 38 years, his illness, the duration of this has been kind of seen as almost the hopelessness of his condition. His marked and naming difference excluded deviant kind of identities, understood to be isolated, segregated, marked by his solitude. Verse 5 says, one man was there, one man amongst the many. His prolonged inactive state is assumed to understand, and I quote some of biblical commentaries, a lifetime of hopelessness and sin, a marginalized death-like state. He is out of time, out of place. Victimhood, deviance, disorder, sin are all very common in relation to his interpretation. And like the blind man at Bethsaida, often in New Testament interpretations, this man has been seen as a metaphorical siphon for other characters. So you'll remember that in John's Gospel, we have this very strange term, apos synagoges, out of the synagogue, which has often been read to a community situation in which synagogue and Christian kind of relationships are at breaking point, and therefore this man has always been read metaphorically for those that sit kind of outside, that sit in a place of otherness. In the words of one recent commentator, this man is a stark contrast to the very lovable man in John's Gospel who was born blind. So if there's any sort of hierarchy of disability, this character is often seen as right on the edges. So how could Crypt Culture make anything of what seems to be such a dismal, ableist kind of interpretation? Well, crypt hermeneutics and crypt culture makes us very much look at narratives through the lens of performance. They often look at space, how disability is enacted, and how it can be enacted to mean differently. They often look at conceptions of time, because actually time as a category, we live in a, neoliberal capitalist cultures are very sort of under the tyranny of speed and productiveness. And sort of slow time is something that is very other to that kind of normative mindset. And crypt culture very much kind of focuses on time and also on embodiment. So what do we notice about time and space within this narrative? Any thoughts? Time, space, embodiment. People have noticed the 38 years as time, other elements that index time or space. Please do pop in the chat or someone's wrote, Zena said about the slowness of his movement. Sabbath time, fantastic. Yes, we have ritualized time, and actually in many translations of this text, it's often called the healing of the man at the pool or the healing on the Sabbath. So it's often seen as a text which is more about Jesus's kind of transgressing boundaries of Sabbath rather than perhaps a healing narrative. But in both of those instances, whether it's a healing narrative or whether it's transgressing sort of Sabbath time, in a sense, the man at the pool is still a prop within a larger kind of narrative. Yes, fantastic. Amelia picks up on that. You can't work on the Sabbath, so the healing on that day is taboo. So who is the kind of cripping figure here? Is Jesus part of this kind of narrative? Well, what I'm going to do in thinking about how we can reread this text, I'm going to introduce you to two disability activists. They're both UK based, but their work is available online, and hopefully if you want to follow this up in your own context, you can use some of this. So if you could pop the slide down for me, please, Nikki. Thank you. My first example is from an artist activist called Liz Crow. I was really struck in Becca's presentation how you talked about the invisibility of much disability. We often think of disability, or the ableist gaze wants to put a body in their sights, but actually there's a whole lot of hidden, invisible disabilities, which means that it is everywhere and nowhere. We don't sort of realize this. And Liz Crow in 2012 and 2013, British artist and disability activist performed a piece called Bedding Out. And it was installed in Salisbury Arts Centre and at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. And it was used as a piece of Crypt performance to question and protest against the UK government welfare cuts for disability. The piece involved Liz lying in her bed, exhibiting what she called bed life for 48 hours. By publicly exposing and displaying her hidden and protracted experience of inactivity, what she called bedding out, she hoped she would raise awareness of her own and of others' temporalities and protest against the stigmatizing of disabled bodies as somehow idle or indolent or slothful. And she writes, she says the following, and I quote her: "On this stage, for a period of 48 hours, I am performing the other side of my fractured self, my bed life. Since the public me is so carefully constructed, this will be a kind of unperforming of myself. I want to show that many people see as a contradiction what they call a fraud is only the complexity of real life. This is not a work of tragedy, but of invisibility and complication, a chance to perform myself without a facade," I close quote. So one of her main purposes was to make explicit the very different performances that she has in different spaces. So one of the welfare cuts was to audit whether you were able enough to work. And she's saying, you know, in much of my life, I can look that way. I can pass as normal. But then there's this whole hidden shadow side of me that is exhausted, has chronic fatigue, and I'm in bed for a long time. And so she invited people to come and watch her in bed, and she had bedside conversations where she talks about the injustices of the welfare system in the UK. And she talked about public, private, concealed, revealed, and preparing for public life, and what she called recovering from public life, how public life was so exhausting for her. And I want to think about whether her 48 hours in bed in any way can be thought about in tandem with our man at the pool, who was sat for 38 years, inactive, invisible, amongst his context. The story of the man at the pool in John 5, I think, can be seen to raise awareness of bed life and intentionally juxtapose the normal rhythms of time and space, which include, and in the narrative it's indexed by Sabbath time, cultic rhythm, year's time. The story begins with saying, this is a festival of the Jews. So the scene shifts to Jerusalem Sheep Gate, and the name of the Sheep Gate has variously been translated as House of Mercy or House of Outpourings, with 5 porticos under which we're told many blind, lame, paralyzed are. The first thing that Jesus says to this man, he seems to know his history. He says, do you want to be made whole? In verse 6. Do you want to be made whole? And the man replies, well, no one's put him in the pool when the water is stirred up, for when he wakes his way down, others go in front of him. To which Jesus says the following, Ageri aron ton krabaton, rise up and take your mattress. Ageri, rise up. And the man duly does so. But never in the narrative are we told specifically that, in a sense, it's the healing that is the problem, because the ensuing conversation is all, in many ways, about the act of carrying the mat on the Sabbath. The man's approached by Jewish leaders in verse 10, and later in the temple, He goes into the temple. This is very interesting on space, sort of social mobility, a place where he hasn't been able to go into beforehand. He now takes this mat and walks into the temple. He crypts the Sabbath. He breaks the Sabbath. You're allowed to carry someone on a mat on the Sabbath, but not carry your own mat. And he goes into a space he has been at this point excluded from. For 38 years, he has not entered this space. And really interesting, a gyri, rise up, is actually used elsewhere in the John's Gospel, not to mean a physical standing up. It's used in relation to raising up, in relation to resurrection life. It can be thought of as an ideological standing up for oneself. So in a sense, what's happening in this encounter? How can we think of this spotlight on his bedding out, making us rethink what we are doing? Kafer, who's a crypt theorist, talks about bending disabled bodies and minds to meet the clock. That's what happens in normative culture. And she says that actually crypt time bends the clock to meet disabled bodies. Crypt time bends the clock to meet disabled bodies. The Sabbath clock is not an inhibition to this man's raising up. The Passover and the rhythms of the year are not an inhibitor to this man being raised up. Crypt time bends the clock. And I think in this narrative, we have a bending of the clock. But what can we say about his actual movement? I've said to you a little bit about the step metaphor being put down into the pool. J. Demarge has noted that step metaphors implicated here in the stepping down to the pool image have powerful connotations in crypt culture. Interrogating step metaphors works to highlight not just how spaces are exclusionary, but also the ways that you can start to distance a hypothetical us and them, able, unable, ill and cured. But it also shows that crypt culture depends on a network of relationships and a network of allies. Crypt time is grounded in the disabled body being the centre of the encounter, and the flexibility and the slowness that truly involves. The mat too, the krabaton in verse 10, is actually a colloquial term, usually translated mat or bed, and it's frequently used for the pallet, mattress or bedding of the poor. And this is here again, I think, a sort of crypt association we can make between Liz Crow's bedding out performance and this the economic lot of the individual sat at the pool. So time, space and embodiment, I think, can, at least at the moment that the man lays on the pauper's bed and rises up and takes his own mat, can powerfully be displayed and suspended in light of some of the insights that Liz Crow's activist piece gives us. I'm going to tell you about another activist piece now. If you could put down the slide, please, Nikki. Brilliant, thank you. The next piece is again by a British artist, Naomi Lackmeyer, and it's called One Morning in May. She was a disabled performance artist that you can see there in the picture, clad in business dress. She made the journey from Toynbee Studios in Tower Hamlets, which is a very deprived area on the outskirts of London, the East End, to the Gherkin building, which you may well know as one of the most iconic pieces of architecture in the city, the financial district of London, it's very much become a symbol, an ivory tower, a phallic kind of symbol of London's place within the global financial industry. So she travels from a place of deprivation to the heart of economic privilege. For normate bodies to walk this journey, and you have it there on the map, it would probably take around 1.5 hours to walk at a comfortable place. For Lackmeyer, however, in her performance piece, it took 7 hours as she crawled on her hands and knees through the streets of London. Her professional business attire got increasingly stained and tattered as her journey progressed. And she describes her piece as a powerful role play with the viewer, who is forced into the dominant role through my action, forced to react in one way or another. We're going to watch a clip of it in a moment, and you'll see that people sort of have different reactions. Well, some say, are you okay? Do you need help? Others say, kind of look on the other side and kind of, you know, sort of try and ignore what's happening. But she forces inquisitive stares, she forces reaction. And she says, I wanted to cross over the border of these worlds, the poverty of Tower Hamlets versus the affluence of the financial city of London, in a slow and strenuous way. Dressed as them as business dress, while clearly being other socially, politically, economically, physically. And of course, when she arrives at the Gherkin, she's dirty, her clothes are torn, it literally looks out of place. So this is quite a long clip. We're just going to watch a little bit of it to get an idea of this. So could you please share the YouTube clip, Nikki?
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you. What are you doing? I'm doing a piece of artwork, a performance.
That's amazing, eh? What's it called? Crawling on my hands and knees. It's called
Okay.
It's all right.
I'm fine, people are running around with thank you very much, Dirk.
okay, Nikki, if you'd like to stop the clip and go back to the handout, it's a very long one, but it's worth a watch, especially when she gets to the gherkin. It's a really powerful piece. So can we use this piece of Crypt Culture again to reread our John 5 narrative? We'll see it in a different kind of way. The story of the man at the pool, I suggest, could similarly be read as a demonstration against spatial and ideological segregation. This time, not based on perhaps economy, although I think it does have economic implications, based on sacred time and space, respectively represented in this story by the Sabbath and the temple. The Sabbath and the temple. And I've said that the narrative is commonly referred to either as a healing at the pool or a Sabbath healing. The former points to a presumed curative miracle. The latter implies transgression of time and of space. Most commentators focus on one of these, and typically their energies are directed towards Jesus's words and attitudes, rather than the actions of the man at the pool, who is understood just to follow instructions that are given to him. As Kevin Kwass notes, Jesus presents himself as the Son of God, who has the authority to work on the Sabbath. Others have argued that here is a healing tradition which may have been purposely redacted by John into a Sabbath controversy to speak about tensions in his own community with the Jewish authorities. So on, a Sabbath controversy is about maps of law. But actually, if we are to think that John talks on what is a physiognomic consciousness, I'll write that in the chat in a moment. Physiognomy is the kind of idea which was very common from Aristotelian constructions of the body onwards, that your morality could be seen and interpreted from your physical body. And so, for instance, judgments about moral character could be made about your comportment or the way that you walked. Weak ankles were seen as feminine, and that weak ankles would mean that you couldn't play kind of, it was related to feebleness, to cowardice, to effeminacy. So I've said that rise up, take your mat and walk. Maybe in Crypt Culture isn't a physical walk-in, maybe not a physical walk-in, it is a rising up for rights that actually says, rather than the stigma or the imposed stigma of this person's access to the temple, actually, in a sense, this is a raising up of someone's consciousness to have the confidence to go into a space they've been excluded from. And this, I think, is what Naomi Lackmeyer's piece is about. It's trying to protest about the ways in which socially, economically, she is seen as other within that financial district. In many ways, could this John text also be doing a similar thing for our man at the pool? It's when he goes into the temple that actually the main, the recognition that he has changed, when Jesus says uncomfortably, don't sin again, but actually you were in a place you weren't in before. Nancy Myers, too, a wheelchair user, unveils the ways in which healthy, normal, proportional bodies construct morality aligned with physical form. She contrasts the metaphors of being morally upstanding with negatively being looked down upon. As such, body that shapes the language is not hers. In fact, it's a language that negates her body. Other people in the more radical end of historical Jesus studies, so John Dominic Crossan and John Pilt, talk about, and I'm going to write this, rather than physical disease, actually social dis-ease, the ways in which the cartography and maps of meaning make people displaced. Could we therefore see this not as a curative imaginary, but actually one in which the man at the pool
moves, crawls, gets into a space that he wasn't allowed to be in. So peripaptai, which is often translated as walk, can also be go, move about, live, or conduct yourself in verse 8. Could it be a different way of living? Is it not physical mobility, but social mobility? Nancy Meyer says that she was always thought that people walking, able-bodied people walking, can be naive about what walking is. She says that she was very, she's an amputee, and she says, you know, I've always been able to walk. I have ambulatory movement, hips back and forth. She said she notes how a medical professional discovered I had hips, and that seemed to surprise him, but it didn't surprise me. Andreas Kostenberger too talks in rabbinic tradition about how, in a sense, it was permissible to carry a bed with a person lying on it, but not one that was empty. So actually, this man carrying his own mat on the Sabbath, a pauper's mat from one socio-economic domain, the outside pool, to the center of economic activity in the temple, displays social mobility. And so Jesus's kind of words in the thing, you've been made whole, don't sin again, maybe not be an acknowledgement of a link between sin and illness, but rather a testimonial to the man's courage in subversively contravening the maps of exclusion that he perhaps and his body has been subject to. Now, this, of course, is a very evocative, radical kind of reading, but these kinds of reimagining of perfection, I think, are really, really important in trying to think about how we preach or teach or interpret biblical material. Because the ways, and Angela was totally right about classification and discourse, because what we talk about in relation to humanity and normate human experiences, capabilities of action and ability, they always tend to be backdrop, whether consciously or not, on essentialist, hierarchical and exclusionary histories. And we need to be aware of that. And Crypt Culture makes us aware of those kinds of unspoken norms. Crypt Culture allows us to talk back at dominant interpretive histories of our canonical texts. And they can also, in a sense, hermeneutical experiments like this can evoke alternative voices. Musa Dube, famous post-colonial feminist, says just this kind of thing when she invites us, the journey we, biblical scholars, choose to participate in, and the space we inhabit our reading practices are therefore acts that have an impact on our world and on our neighbours' worlds. And we as readers cannot be neutral in that struggle. And I want to suggest that some of the crypt kind of performances, the ways in which cryptic enactments can reimagine these biblical narratives, can give us alternative perspectives to reimagine a future that perhaps is more inclusive. We have a lot to learn. We have a lot to listen to. And I'm so pleased that this afternoon's material was kind of interjected by a really powerful kind of testimony that shows just that. To end with, I want to bring out some of the reflections that people have, because I'm aware I haven't allowed much time for questions at all. So if you could put the final slide up, please, Nikki. We have about 20 minutes, I think, to open up questions, but I wanted to start with these three as kind of a prompt, but I'm very happy for the conversation to go in what way you would like to. So the first one was, are you aware of how ableism or ableist assumptions, words, have operated within your context, work, or biblical interpretations?
What do you make of disability critical crypt perspectives which challenge assumptions about disabilities, including compulsory cure? And this is very, very central. Nothing for us without us is the mantra of disability activism worldwide. And how in our practices, in your ministry, in your preaching, in your biblical interpretation, how are we trying to engage diverse voices and experiences in practice? So who would like to start us off? It would be great if we could have a conversation going. So please unmute yourself and make some connections.
If I may, there are a lot of divisions within the disability community in regards to type of disability, acquired versus chronic, which is why I made sure to carefully mention those with invisible disability in terms of, we talked, Dr. Parker, you mentioned like passing, some can pass as abled, and in some ways that is an advantage, in some ways it's very much a disadvantage. I'm one of those people who has I can never pass as abled, except for maybe now on a Zoom call, right? And so I think for people within the disability activism community, it's also a sense of, like you said at the beginning of your lecture, I don't represent everyone. And also that there are experiences of disability. I have several friends that sign language was a very popular major in undergrad, and so several of my friends are in the deaf community as well, and sometimes they would rather not identify as disabled, right? So there's a lot of, I think, cultural nuance to that, and so for me as a disability activist, it's being aware of those nuances and not gatekeeping in terms of who counts as disabled and who doesn't.
Yes, thank you. That's a really key point. And yeah, individual experiences and people where they would situate on themselves on, and how much they would volunteer to kind of about their experience. It also is very, very different. I think there are kind of dominant grooves though of how not just biblical interpretation, but theology, it's kind of, a liturgy of have been very enlightened on some areas, on gender but less so on ableism and saneism, which I haven't mentioned today, but kind of prejudice around the ways in which mental health and mental illness are kind of constructed in religious spaces. What are your thoughts on the kind of cripping of these narratives? Any? So I need to confess this. Oh.
Would you repeat your question? I didn't quite understand what our thoughts around what of the narrative.
Oh, around the crypt perspectives, the ways in which we've thought about, going against this idea of compulsory cure, thinking about the characters. Yeah, just the themes that we've talked about today, whether things have struck you or things that you think, oh, I really don't agree with that.
I have a question if I'm not spreading over a chat because I'm driving right now, so I can't see. So I'm able-bodied, so I'm coming at this from a privileged learning perspective. And I'm very deeply appreciative to both you and Becca for presenting this amazing lecture. It's been so informative, so I'm very grateful. So my question around crypt culture is there any talk within that realm, within that school of thought about making sure, or is there a perceived need at all to make sure that when disabled and able-bodied people alike discuss crypt culture, that it isn't associated with like crypt gang culture?
I'm going to let Becca start with that one.
That's actually a valid concern when I'm trying to, I think, describe Crypt culture to, you know, my audience, which is like my family and my community, because you start at the first stage of a lot of people are surprised when I use the term disabled instead of person with a disability. And you have to dismantle that before you can even approach using the term Crypt culture. Otherwise, people will just initially have that, like, wait a second, isn't that a gang? Which I think if you look into the history of, and this is something I haven't done yet and probably need to do, the history of kind of gang culture and how I think for us in the US, it is has mostly been used, in my perspective, I've seen it mostly used as a construction of white people to have excuse to be racist, right? Gang, quote unquote, gang violence was one of the reasons that the public high school I went to, a lot of people sent their kids to private school instead. But I went to that public school, and and personally, like, to my knowledge, gang violence was never an issue. So I don't know enough about the intricacies of that, but I feel like there's enough social distance that unless I am explaining Crypt culture to a terrified white person, I usually don't have to differentiate. And maybe Dr. Parker or any of the Black people in the audience today, if you wanted to chime in there, you know, because again, I'm coming from a space of whiteness, but that's been my experience with it.
I do not know enough about the Crypt gang culture to talk about the differentiation or how you can even begin to unpack that. I'm still coming with I think someone said, I'm still confessing my own ableist assumptions. So I'm still at number one, even before I've gotten to Crypt perspectives and the connection to thinking through Crypt culture as in Crypt gang culture.
I have a thought, if I may, about the third statement, nothing for us without us. Yeah. I don't know, Becca, when it was offered to you to be a part of the conversation, but I know also being part of the public schools, you would have, and being born after the ADA, you would have been, your parents would have had conversations like 504s, IEPs. And the strange thing about that is the student's not a part of the conversation. In fact, my daughter comes home and says, it's so strange that I take this test, a different test than the other people. And I'm like, oh gracious, are we teaching other kids that there's like this dirty secret about disability when we should just be talking about it naturally from the beginning? I don't think we enter that conversation letting kids or young adults be a part of the conversation until maybe there's some real damage done to the psyche, to the family, to the school, to the community.
Yeah, I come from, you know, my mom was a special educator, but like, I had to recently explain to my mom what eugenics is. The thing about special education as a field, it's great, and I have the highest respect for special educators, but they are being taught, you know, outdated material. I have a friend who is currently getting her master's in educational policy, and they're still being taught to use person first language. When, again, that is something that kind of varies depending on who you're working with. But it does revolve around this idea of tiptoeing around the disability instead of addressing it for what it is. What happened to me personally in public education, and perhaps your daughter can relate to this, is that it started to become over accommodating. An example, my teacher was concerned in, I think it was 4th grade, that my feet didn't touch the floor when I was sitting at my desk. So they got me a shorter desk. But what that meant was the other desks on either side of me were up here, and I was now down here. right? And okay, now my feet touch the floor, but I am being further isolated from my classmates. Same thing, my gym teacher would create alternative activities. So while my class was playing basketball, I was in the corner twirling a ribbon, right? And I know that to some extent, it's progressed beyond that point. I was in many ways a victim of kind of the late 80s, early 90s models of education, but I think in many cases, public schools are still, and private schools don't even have to comply with the ADA, which is a whole other thing. But in many ways, special educators are being taught this outdated material, and I'm hopeful that there are educators that will rise up to create something better. But I can definitely speak to that experience. And I guess my advice would be, especially for people with children, I say just address disability head on. You'll notice, you know, as I'm rolling down the street, perhaps, and people kind of pull their children away from me, or don't stare, it's not nice to stare, or, you know, and I, when I have the opportunity, like, I'm glad to invite children to, you know, they have questions, and it's okay to answer those questions as honestly as you can, as long as you can do so developmentally appropriately. I have a 1.5-year-old goddaughter, or godniece. My sister is the godmother. And so, like, one of my kind of goals for her is, like, you're never gonna grow up to be afraid of mobility devices, right? I want you to see these crutches and see this walker, see this wheelchair, and you don't have to be afraid of it. And so I think that's one thing for children. It's easy to say, no, that person isn't broken. They're not a spectacle. They're just a person, and sometimes people need help.
Thank you all so much for this conversation today. I serve in a congregational setting, and one of the biggest things that I have experienced is curriculum that is not, I mean, it's just not cognizant or aware of congregations and communities of students that have disabilities. So it's really frustrating when you pick up curriculum for youth group and it has a relay at the beginning or some type of activity right off the bat. I will say one curriculum that we used over the summer is from Illustrated Ministry. It's called Compassion Camp. And that curriculum is actually has on their murals. They're known for their, murals that they create and their coloring pages that go along with the curriculum and Bible stories. And their murals for that curriculum did have multiple visuals and representations of people with disabilities in it. And it was really wonderful because I have a student in the children's ministry who does have a disability, and she was able to fully participate in that VBS, Vacation Bible School, over the summer on Zoom as all of the other children were participating. I mean, it was awesome. And it's made me rethink all of our Vacation Bible Schools that we offer in person now. So I guess my question is, how do we get curriculum companies to reimagine and write in a way that keeps folks in mind? So
I would say, and Louise, you can probably chime in here as someone who is published, but I think part of it is holding those companies accountable for creating a diverse curriculum. I know a few summers ago, I think it was called like Roar VBS curriculum that was centered around Africa, was revealed that the staff that wrote the curriculum was all white. And they got a lot of flack for it, and a lot of people either canceled or changed their curriculum because of that. And I think that we have to do similar when it comes to disability, because often the expectation is the disabled people get their own class. And a lot of churches see that as inclusive, as we have a class for these people, when I think the more inclusive route is what you're referring to, where there are ways to adapt the curriculum. And I think it also depends on the creativity of the administrator, of the person you're handing that curriculum to. And some of that just comes by experience. And also there is, and I think will always be, the pressure on the disabled person to speak up for themselves. I, as a child, was very soft-spoken and did not want to upset anyone. So if something bothered me, I wouldn't tell them unless I was like literally hurt and crying. So also the language of like, it's okay to say when you're uncomfortable. And so I think there are several ways that we have to address that. I think holding them accountable is probably the most powerful one.
Yeah, I think I would echo that. I mean, I don't know about context beyond higher education, of course, but I think in higher education we talk about an explicit curriculum, which is the books we read, the people that we venerate, the sort of frameworks that we teach. And there's a hidden curriculum that often is hidden even to the people that have designed it. And in the UK, at least, I think what Becca's just said, the decolonizing the curriculum agenda has been really key, not least since the Black Lives Matter sort of resurgence last June, and the ways in which imperial histories and our universities in the UK have been, have really complex, knotted histories of oppression. But we've also had to think about disabling the curriculum too. And in biblical studies, one example, a project that I did called Bible and Bedlam, which was on mental illness and mental health. We talk about the ivory tower being this kind of very much European vision of a rational, logical, scientific view of the world, which often put bodies and peoples in categories of hierarchy in very problematic ways. And it was really interesting that something like queer studies, it's been much more open in New Testament studies, where people, when you read their preface, will sometimes come out in prefaces now, or sort of mark their positionality in a way that wouldn't have happened 30 years ago. But very few will ever out themselves as mad studies would say, or neurodivergent, or any of these categories, because that too, researchers and academics still pass as this rationalist, logical, unemotional kind of persona. And so there is a sense, I think, in which those kinds of stories, not least because it's a sector that has huge problems with mental health and kind of stress and anxiety, those kinds of honest conversations and the ways in which the stories that we've talked about, productive time, and this kind of rabbit race we're all on, rat race we're all in, those kinds of things also, erode people's mental health. And so disabling, I think, the curriculum and having more honest conversations around those areas, I think, would be really helpful. I teach a course called Deviant Bodies, and last week we looked at Philippians with the idea of not, don't worry, don't be anxious. Well, we're in a global pandemic. We've got the highest mental health troubles that anyone has had in the student population at the moment in the UK. And that kind of triumphalist narrative is hard to swallow in those sorts of times. So I think we do have to be really aware of our curricula. The other thing that really struck me when Becca said, inclusion is about putting on some program that will kind of tick the inclusion box. I think that's so true. And just like with every other advocacy approach, it's not just about including to a mainstream, it's about having role models in leadership. So when will we, we've got Hannah Lewis wrote a brilliant book called Deaf Liberation Theology. She is the only culturally deaf priest in a normal mainstream church in the UK. We've got pulpits that have got steps up to them, the whole infrastructure, isn't about leadership and disability. And so she's a very powerful kind of advocate. But nothing for us without her. So I spoke at the Signs of God conference, and I spoke before her, and then she said, no matter what allies, able-bodied allies want to say about me, or want to, their do-gooding intentions, you need to listen to our voices. And I'm always very aware of that in a sense, nothing for us without us, and also nothing for us without us needs to go into leadership roles too.
Another on a practical level, you can hire a sensitivity reader. So if you are writing a curriculum or a lecture or a sermon, and you want to know how to make it more accessible, or is this ableist, you can hire a disabled person to do a sensitivity reading for you. That's something that I offer, and something that a lot of disabled writers offer.
Wow,
that's really a super practical way to go about it.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, almost like audit kind of so there's so much of English language is about it sort of has, we talk of rich veins and metaphors. All of our language is propagated on cognitive linguistics and the idea of the body. So you slip into this. Remember, my mum was in hospital, and it was really sort of jarring that the song we had in the chapel on the Sunday was stand up for Jesus, and very few people in that room could, it was like, oh, that wasn't the best kind of language. Yeah.
I hate to interrupt this very thoughtful dialogue. I know Dr. Parker's about to go. There's something about classroom duties and responsibilities, but Dr. Parker is our professor of New Testament and Greek. I've heard several in the chat section saying, I'm so sorry I missed you when I was in school, or others saying, I wish I had you. Dr. Parker often opens her classroom open to audits, so you can experience a fantastic professor here at McAfee School of Theology. Dr. Lawrence, let me thank you for speaking to us across the pond, as they say. And I think for all of us that preach, that teach, that think, reflect, we are all compelled after today's lecture series to revisit what we are think of with perfection, reimagining perfection, to play off of that title. So again, I thank you for that incredible challenge. Becca Ray, thank you for embodying this both in mind and body, literally and theologically, and for keeping us in this dialogue. I wish I could redo this, and I would just have co-presenters, Professor Louise Lawrence and Reverend Becca Ray, and we would just step out of the way and do some more learning. My friends, we have been blessed and benefited by our time together. I thank you. When we conclude, you're more than welcome to hang around if you'd like, if you want to kind of visit or chat. There's several words that come to mind: everywhere and nowhere, reimagining perfection. But what I really like is the benediction, somewhat intimated by an interpretive reading of John 5 by Professor Lawrence, something to the effect of, go and move about and remember that you are beloved of God. Amen and amen. Thank you, Professor Lawrence. We're so glad you joined us. Let's give her a hand.